Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to paint these plastic British Commandos in 28mm scale by Warlord for their game Bolt Action. As you can see, they have already been primed using Vallejo Black Surface Primer. Each model has a small piece of brass rod glued into one foot. This allows the model to stand without a base, with the rod poked into some foam as shown here, and it provides a sort of handle while painting. I might as well say this now, I'm definitely not an expert on World War II colours, so I will probably get some colours wrong. I say wrong with air quotes. The more astute amongst you will have noticed that I'm definitely not a rivet counting kind of guy. I've got a couple of references that I'm going to use as rough guides, but I'm taking some liberties, experimenting, and going with what looks good to me. Let's get to it. I start by using my airbrush to spray a base coat of Vallejo Model Colour English uniform, mostly focusing, well, on the uniforms. The goal here is to get a nice solid coating. This colour doesn't cover the black so easily right away, so I take it slowly and build up the layers, rather than just blasting out a load of brown paint and obscuring all the details. The next thing I did was a kind of zenithal highlight. I sprayed the models with Model Colour US Field Drab from directly above. It didn't make an enormous difference, but I could see a very subtle highlight, which is what I like. To be honest, I think this step might be redundant, owing to later highlighting and washes, but I was just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks, really. While I had the airbrush out, I went ahead and sprayed the berets, which I'd left off for painting. For this, I used Flames of War branded Vallejo Russian Green. It's a different shade to the Model Air Russian Green that I usually use for tanks. I then highlight these from above with a light spray of Model Colour Uniform Green. We'll come back to these later. Something else we will come back to later are the bases. I've roughly sprayed some colour onto these, first with Model Air Mud Brown, and then with Model Air Burnt Umber. The next thing I did was to paint the backpacks with Vallejo Model Colour Russian Uniform. Be careful not to get this colour onto the brown uniform parts. Of course, mistakes do happen, and that's okay, but the less cleanup we have to do later the better. You may need to do a couple of coats of this to achieve a good solid colour. I then mixed 4 parts Russian uniform to 1 part Model Colour Buff, and dry brushed it onto the upper portions of the backpacks. I went fairly heavily with this. Next, I painted the straps, webbing, and pouches. I would have to say this was probably the least enjoyable part for me, owing to just how many straps there were. That said, it's not particularly hard, just time consuming. The colour I am using here is Model Colour German Camouflage Beige, though not all of the webbing and pouches will be done in this colour. I chose to use a few colours for the simple reason that I enjoy variety. That said, I did paint all of the straps on the backpacks with German Camouflage Beige. There isn't really a lot to say about this other than it's a good idea to go slowly and carefully. I also used German Camouflage Beige on all of the entrenching tool covers for all the soldiers. I wasn't sure if this should match the rest of the webbing, but I didn't really care. I did some of the webbing in Model Colour Pastel Green. One of the colour guides I looked at suggested this colour as one of the varieties for the webbing, and I was skeptical, but I'm happy with how it turned out. The other colour I used on the webbing was Model Colour Iraqi Sand. Using 3 colours for the webbing created a nice variety that breaks up some of the monotony of having 25 figures all wearing identical uniforms in what I think is a sensible way. I used Iraqi Sand on some of the pouches too. I randomly used the Iraqi Sand and German Camouflage Beige pouches on different coloured webbing so that some of the models would be mismatched. I think this creates some nice differences without much extra effort. Next, I painted the bag most of my commandos carry on their left hip. For this, I used the Flames of War branded Russian Green. I then lightly dry brushed the bags with Russian Uniform, focusing mostly on the top and corners of the bag. I then painted the water bottle using Vallejo Model Air Camouflage Olive Green. I read somewhere that the canvas covers on these water bottles would be kept wet to keep the contents cool, so I figured the darker green here might reflect that. I wasn't entirely satisfied with the colour though, so I dry brushed the water bottles fairly heavily with Vallejo German Uniform. To finish off the water bottles, I painted their straps. For this, I used the colours to match the webbing on each model, those being German Camouflage Beige, Pastel Green, and Iraqi Sand. This was quite fiddly to do, so the key is to go slowly and carefully. I fixed any little errors I made here with Russian Green. I then moved on to the entrenching tool handle. I painted this with Model Colour Beige Brown, being careful not to paint over the beige on the straps. Of course, most of these are hidden by the backpacks, so I painted as much of them as I could. I then applied black primer to all of the bayonet scabbards on the models that have them. I also used this primer for the sheathed knives that I put on a few of my commandos. I used the primer for this because it coats better than the Model Air Black that I have, and it doesn't need thinning. Another small accessory that not all of my commandos have is a gun holster. I painted these with Vallejo Model Air Burnt Umber. I also used black primer on the small portion of the gun that is visible. At this point, it occurred to me that the strap across the chest of the commandos is for the bag on their left hip, and so I repainted those with Russian Green to match the bags. This probably wouldn't have been a big issue, but it would have bugged me if I didn't fix it. I then painted the rope that comes on all of the backpacks using Vallejo Model Colour Buff. I thought this colour was a little bit bright at first, but that will be taken care of with washes. Next, I applied Iraqi Sand to the gaiters. If I had been thinking ahead, I could have painted these while I was using this colour on the webbing and pouches. Now for some metallic paint. I used Vallejo Model Air gun metal to paint the tip of the entrenching tool handle, as well as the buckles of the entrenching tools and backpacks. This might be a kind of redundant step, but if you look really close on the finished models, you can see it, so maybe it wasn't totally wasted time. I finished this by adding a spot of German camouflage beige on the raised portion of the middle of the buckle to represent the strap going through the metal part. I then applied a wash of strong tone mixed approximately 50-50 with water. I put this all over the uniform and equipment to slightly darken everything and add shading to the creases and gaps and such. While I was waiting for that wash to dry, I applied a wash of undiluted green tone on the berets. If I was to redo this, I might water this wash down a little bit. After the wash on the figures dried, I applied another wash to the ropes, this time undiluted soft tone to make the rope look more used and dirty. I did consider adding extra highlighting to these, but I figured it looked fine without. I did, however, add a little bit of highlighting to the uniform by dry brushing some US Field Drab onto the upper portions of the arms and legs. This is kind of subtle, but that's how I want it. I'm not really into that extreme contrasting highlight that you see on some wargaming models. Now to paint the skin. Next time I do this, I'm definitely going to paint the head separately. It will make things so much easier. The base colour I used for this is Model Colour Flat Flesh. This colour is really light, so I had to do a few coats of it to get a good coverage. Obviously I'm being very careful here to avoid getting it on the uniform. I then washed all the skin with Secret Weapon Flesh Wash. This was a little bit yellow and I didn't really like it that much. Next time I might use a darker, more red wash for this layer. Over the top of the wash I applied a fairly heavy dry brushing of flat flesh. Again, trying to avoid getting it on the uniform, though it's very hard to do so. Fortunately, it can always be fixed later. You can see what a big difference this layer of dry brushing has made to the skin. I add another highlight using Model Colour Light Flesh, focusing mostly on the upper parts of the face and hands. I think the light flesh might be a little too bright and contrasty here. I'm not great at painting human skin, so this is kind of a learning process for me. Next, I applied a wash of approximately 1 part flesh wash and 4 parts water. This reduced the contrasting colours a little bit. It still does look a bit yellow. The camera makes it look even more yellow than it does in person. At this point, I decided to move on and paint the hair. I didn't want to give my commandos all the same hair colour, because that's kinda boring. So, I divided them up randomly into groups to give different hair colours to. 6 black, 3 red, 8 light brown, and 8 dark brown. For the black hair, I again used the Vallejo Black Surface Primer. I carefully highlighted that with Model Colour Black Grey. The 3 redheads received a base coat of Model Colour Amarantha Red, followed by a dry brushing of Model Colour Light Orange. This is the first time I've tried to do red hair. I think it turned out okay. Fortunately though, the hair will mostly be covered on these models. I used Model Colour Chocolate Brown for the dark brown haired commandos. Obviously this step should be done slowly and carefully to avoid having to fix any spillover onto the skin. They then receive a highlight of Beige Brown. And finally, the commandos with light brown hair were base coated with Beige Brown and then highlighted with German Camouflage Beige. Of course, don't forget to very carefully paint on any mustaches or facial hair your models might have. I matched the facial hair to the head hair, but I didn't bother highlighting it. Once I had finished with the hair, I glued the berets onto all the models. I am a little bit dissatisfied with how these sit on most of the heads, but they're not that bad. I did lose a couple, so there are a couple of heads without berets. I gave the berets a fairly heavy dry brushing with Vallejo Uniform Green, which makes them a much brighter green, which I think looks good. There is a little bump on the berets that could be painted gold or yellow, or maybe some other colour, but I liked them being plain green, so I just left it. If I'm honest, I don't think I saved much time at all having these separate. Were I to do it again, I might just glue these onto the heads before painting. Next I begin painting the weapons. Of course, they aren't all the same colours, and I'm sure the colours that I have chosen to paint them in aren't 100% historically accurate, but they look good to me. I painted the mortar tubes Model Colour Reflective Green. I did the same with the P-Art, which, yes, I do know is being held incorrectly. I also painted its ammo the same colour on the figure holding that. These green weapons received a light dry brushing of reflective green mixed roughly 50-50 with Model Colour Buff. I think I might have made this highlight a little bit too subtle. I also elected not to paint the bands on the P-Art ammo, though I have seen pictures of it with yellow or brown stripes. I used Model Colour German Camouflage Beige for whatever this part of the P-Art is, some kind of cover I think, and to represent the canvas on the shoulder pad thing on the back. Again, maybe not 100% historically accurate, but I saw images with similar colours and I liked the way it looked, so that's what I did. For some reason, I didn't film myself painting the stocks of the rifles, Thompsons or Bren guns, but I painted them all with Model Colour Mahogany. I painted their metal parts with a mix of 4 parts black primer and 1 part Model Air gunmetal. Plain gunmetal is way too shiny, though maybe next time I would add more of it to the mix. The Stens, Brens, and Thompsons were much easier to paint than the rifles, being that they're almost entirely metal. The Mahogany looked a bit too bright at this stage, so I applied a wash of undiluted dark tone to the entirety of all the weapons. Make sure you don't miss the gun stocks that can be hidden under arms and such. I also used the dark tone on the green weapons, though I didn't want to make them look too dirty. I mostly used the wash here to try and create a sense of an opening on the end of the mortar and piard. It works well enough from a distance, and it's much easier than trying to drill out the tray part of the piard. I then paint any bayonets with plain Model Air gunmetal. I figure it's probably fairly accurate to have these relatively shiny. I also gave a couple of my commandos scoped rifles. I painted the scopes on these with black surface primer. It doesn't show up that well on camera, but there is a very subtle difference between the colour of the gun barrel and the scope, though really I might as well have just used the same colour for both. You can see here that I've spilled some of the wash on this figure's shoulder and got some skin colour on his collar when I was doing the face, so to fix them I used a very thin coat of English uniform. I use this to correct any mistakes on the uniform. A wash can be used to darken this colour later if needed. Next I did a little bit of highlighting using a mix of about 3 parts US Field Drab and 1 part buff. I mostly apply this to the edges of the collars, pockets, and cuffs on the commandos' uniforms. These are probably the least subtle highlights that I did. I then corrected any errors on the straps, obviously using the same colour the strap had originally been painted. Most of the errors that I had to correct were spills from washes. I guess I need to be neater with that in the future. At this point, I decided that I wasn't exactly satisfied with the skin colour, so I applied a very light wash of strong tone and water, approximately 4 parts water to 1 part strong tone. While that wash was drying, I applied a very light highlight using a dry brushing of model colour black grey on all the black parts of the guns except the rifles. I used black grey here rather than a metallic colour because I want a subtle highlight and I don't want the guns to look too shiny. Nobody wants to carry a bright silver gun into a battlefield. Next I added small amounts of undiluted dark tone to the eyes and mouths of the commandos. I also applied it to most of the spaces between the arms and the cuff of the uniform, and anywhere else that I thought needed a little bit of darkening. I then painted the boots using black primer. I did this so late in the process because even with the brass rod to hold while painting, the boots were still getting bumped a lot and I didn't want to have to repaint them, so I left them till last. I applied a dry brushing of black grey to the boots because clean black just didn't look right. I then applied some gloss varnish to the shoulders of the commandos. Once it was dry, I applied the decals. This was easier to do one shoulder at a time rather than trying to keep track of left and right decals. This was a pretty easy and straightforward application of decals. I only used the black patches. There are rank stripes included on the decal sheet, but I didn't bother with them. I couldn't really be bothered researching what stripes each guy should have and how many of each rank I might need. I did read somewhere that rank markings were removed prior to battle, and that's about all the justification I need to omit them. I use Humroll decal fix when doing the decals, and I carefully use brushes and a knife to slide the decal around until I'm happy with its position. After I got all 50 decals on, I applied another coat of gloss varnish to protect them, and stuck each commando into a blob of plasticine. I used this plasticine as a handle while airbrushing them with AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. Now onto the bases. I'm not going to do anything particularly complicated with these. I glued them to some baking paper to make the process a little bit easier. I put some PVA glue on each base and spread it out using a crappy old brush. I try to avoid getting the glue on the sides of the bases. I then add static grass using my static grass applicator. It simply creates a static charge that makes the grass stand up on end. I've used a variety of slightly different colours and lengths of grass here. I'm pretty happy with the result. Not the most exciting bases, but I don't think they really need to be. I give the bases a quick spray with matte varnish to kill the shine of the PVA glue, and then I attach the models. I take the figure and roughly estimate where I would like to place him. I do my best to remember where the pin was, and then drill a hole. I then use the drill to widen the hole to give the brass rod a tiny bit of wiggle room. Then I test fit the figure to the base. When I'm happy with it, I put a drop of superglue on each foot and slot him into place, pressing down so that the model bonds to the base and not just some strands of grass. I then trim the excess brass rod off, doing my best to get it flush with the bottom of the base. And that's it. Bolt-action plastic commandos all painted up, ready to ruin some krauts. I'm pretty happy with how these have turned out. They're a lot better than I expected. That said, I have learned some lessons. Next time I build figures like these, I will be sure to leave the heads off where possible. That will make painting the skin a lot easier, and skin is something I certainly need to work on. I'm still not 100% happy with the skin tone. I think I could do much better were I to start again. This is all okay. Getting in and doing things and learning from mistakes so you can refine your work next time is much better than hesitating because you might not do a perfect job right away. In the words of Shia LaBeouf, just do it! I'm really happy that these models came with decals, even though it took a really long time to apply them all. I think these commandos look much better with the patch to break up the brown of the uniform and add some interest. I would definitely not have gone to the effort of painting them by hand though, so the decals are great. These figures took me a really long time to paint. It took me a little over a month to get these done. I had actually planned to finish this video for last Monday, but Monday rolled around and I was nowhere near finished. Oh well, best to take your time and be happy with your work rather than rush into a half-assed job. I know they're not super historically accurate colour-wise, and I know somebody is going to feel the need to say, actually, you should have used X colour here or there. I really don't care. I just want models that look good to me. If I was going to try for historical accuracy, I would probably still be stuck researching, reading through conflicting information about the appropriate shade for uniforms, and not painting at all. I much prefer my minimal research, throw shit at the wall and go with what looks good method. I make it no secret that I don't enjoy painting 15mm scale figures, but I have to say that these 28mm scale ones are a lot better and more enjoyable to paint. I do still prefer tanks and vehicles though, so I'm really happy to have these finished. There are enough soldiers here to have a small game, and that means I can field a painted force. And that means my chances of winning against any unpainted foes goes up dramatically. As we know, painted models fight better. I will include a list of all the paints and washes that I've used in the description below. Of course, colour choice is entirely up to you, but it is nice to have some suggestions. I would hesitate to call this video a tutorial. It's really more of a what Herbert did than anything instructional, but I hope it's been helpful or interesting for you. I'd like to see any comments you might have in the comments section below or on Facebook or Twitter, both of which are linked in the description. And if you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe. There will be more painting videos soon, including my Rubicon community group build T-3485s. Thanks for watching. Farewell.